Hello, hello, everybody. Thaís Sky here. Welcome to Reclaim the Podcast. I'm your host, and I'm so thrilled to be here. It's been months since I've recorded the last episode of Reclaim. 2023 is over, and we are firmly January of 2024. And I have so many things that I want to share with you. I wrote down here three big themes, invitations, things that I've been grappling with and thinking about from 2023 that I want to share with you in hopes that it may support you in thinking about your 2024. But before I get into today's episode, I want to let you know something that is a little bit time sensitive. If you are not following me on social media or you're not subscribed to my newsletter, you may not have heard that I have a year in review, a free workbook to support you in reviewing your 2023, available for you to download if you go to thaissky.com/review. It's coming down this Friday. Let's see, today is the 8th. The 12th. Every year I create a year in review. This is, I think, my 7th iteration of the year in review, as an opportunity for me to give back to the community. I'm so appreciative of each and every single one of you who tune in, who listen, who leave a review, who DM me, who reach out to me. I love hearing from you. I love getting to know all of you. I'm so thankful for this community. I wouldn't have a podcast if I didn't have a community of people listening all over the world. And so if you want to grab your year in review, please do so before Friday, where it will come down until the end of 2024 when I come out with my next iteration. So again, thaissky.com/review. I used to love the end of the year and the beginning of the year as an opportunity for me to recalibrate who I am, revise who I am, and create declarations of who I want to be in the new year. There's something so exciting and fresh and inviting about the new year. And while in some ways it's very arbitrary, time is arbitrary, we're making this stuff up. There is something really solid and real about this idea of starting something new. And I think when we are grappling with what it means to heal, what it means to tend to our inner states, what it means to grow, what it means to transform, when we're coming from that place, it can be very seductive to start the new year with a set of declarations, with a set of intentions, with a set of goals, with a set of resolutions, whatever label and name you want to put onto it. If you are ambitious, if you like to goal set, you're probably starting this year wanting something new of yourself for the coming year. That's certainly where I usually find myself at the beginning of years. And what I think tends to then happen is we set these very loud declarations that we believe hasn't happened in our lives out of a willpower, out of lack of drive. And we use the momentum of the new year to try to instill within us urgency to make the changes before our resolve weakens. And so we try to use the momentum of the new year to create these magnificently large changes in our lives, hoping that momentum in and of itself is going to help us in creating the things that we want to create. What is often, I think, missing from that conversation, and what I just want to invite all of us to consider, is that when we're thinking about making changes, when we're thinking about creating something new in our lives, there is usually, whether we're aware of it or not, usually we're not aware of it, there is an opposite force that is keeping us from creating the changes. I often say that if we wanted to change, we would have changed. But the truth of the matter is we both want to change and we also don't want to change. We call this ambivalence. There are things that we want and things that we don't want. We want things different, but we don't want to change. We want to experience something differently, but we don't really want to do we don't really want to recalibrate our internal landscape in order to make that happen. Or alternatively, we are both wanting the thing and terrified of what will happen if we reach the thing. So oftentimes in New Year's, we are more in touch with what we want and less in touch with the reasons for why we haven't gotten what we wanted, or the things that are holding us back, or the reasons why we're still sabotaging. Again, whatever name you want to put to it, we can sometimes gaslight ourselves or override the very urgent and important parts of ourselves that have been trying to communicate something to us by holding us back from doing the thing that we want to do. So sometimes, yes, change is about willpower, setting up the right habits or setting up the right structures in our lives. But more often than not, when we get to understand more of ourselves and understand our ambivalence, and understand what has been holding us back from doing the thing, we grease the wheel, so to speak. We make things easier. Change comes easier, and it requires less will. It requires less of a dominant energy in order to make that happen. I know that I'm speaking very broadly, but I guess I'm just starting the 2024 year with a reminder that I think I say quite often, which is that most of the big changes that we want to make come from slow, very slow, small, bite-sized things that we can do every single day. And most of the time, when we're talking about change, we're often also invited to talk about what has been getting in the way of that change. And until we really understand our ambivalence and our inner conflict and what's been holding us back, we may find that we're going to need more and more willpower to bulldoze through that resistance. And oftentimes you'll be amazed at the strategies that we will find and elicit within ourselves to prevent us from getting the very things that we want. Not necessarily because out of a self-loathing or because we hate ourselves, but simply because we don't know better, or we're afraid of what's going to happen. So let's say that your goal for 2024 is to what's a very common one? Go to the gym more often is a very common goal. We want to be thinking about, what are we afraid will happen if we commit to going to the gym? And what does even going to the gym mean for you? Why is it important for you to go to the gym? What is it that you're hoping that the gym is going to do? If you're hoping that the gym and going to the gym is going to help you feel more in control of your life, well, you'll probably find that that feeling is fleeting. Maybe you'll feel a little bit more in control of your life for a few weeks that you go to the gym, but ultimately it's probably not going to change the relationship you have with your life just because you go to the gym a few times a week, right? So you may have a fantasy that the gym is going to do something for you, but it may actually not tend to the thing that we hope that the gym will do. And so then we'll start to feel disappointed and dissatisfied with going to the gym, because we're thinking, again, we're confounding, we're thinking that the gym is going to do something that it's not doing. And so that it's going to be much harder for us to continue going to the gym. That's just like one of many examples. We may be going to the gym because on some level we're trying to prove something to somebody, and that usually isn't sustainable. Usually what we're trying to prove is going to come out of us navigating and relating to ourselves and what we're feeling like we have to prove differently than going to the gym. So when we start to untangle what it is about the gym that we're really wanting, you may find more spaciousness to decide maybe it's actually not about the gym at all. So maybe that will loosen something up for you, and you may find more joy in going to the gym, and therefore you'll find yourself going to the gym more often. Or as you are continuing to explore and understand your motivations, your thoughts and feelings around going to the gym, you may start to grapple with the fact that to become a healthier version of yourself may mean that you feel more pressure in your life to succeed in other areas, and that may start to feel really debilitating. And so that's why you find yourself not going to the gym. Like, there's so many reasons, so many things beyond just resolutions that may be helpful to think about when we're thinking about the changes that we want to make in the year. And I think oftentimes we are only thinking about the behavior, that we just have to change the behavior. We're not thinking about all of the underlying motivations and thoughts and feelings around the behavior. And I think that that's a missed opportunity for us to learn more about ourselves, understand more about what's driving us, and create ultimately more space for us to decide what we want to do. So that's my New Year's message. Again, I feel like I often repeat this New Year's message, but I've been working with people and sitting in front of people for many years, and I have yet to find that it is through willpower alone that we create the changes that we want. And in fact, while willpower can play a role, it often also serves to perpetuate a sense of shame, a sense of brokenness, a sense of inadequacy and not enoughness. That's not very creative. There are other better ways to inspire change and motivation within us that doesn't come out of treating ourselves with a tremendous amount of self-loathing and self-hate. Okay, so having said all of that, I thought I would spend some time today sharing with you what I've been grappling with and navigating in 2023. Sometimes I think it's useful to use the word like lessons, the lessons that I've been learning and pulling out of the year. I've been reluctant to use that word though, because it does tend to suggest that life is doing something to us, and that if we don't get what we want out of life, it's because life is punishing us in some way. And if we do the right thing, then life will please us in some way. And I just am reluctant to assign that much power to life in and of itself. But sometimes it can be helpful to use the word lessons because it evokes a sense of we're always learning, or if we would like to, we can always learn from what's happening around us, so that we can grow and be more of who we want to be. And I love that, right? I love the idea of life is constantly encouraging us to think and to learn and to grow. And I don't like to think about the idea though that like life is trying to punish us if we're not getting it right. So I want to hold this idea of lessons loosely. One of the big things that occurred for me in 2023 is a family member died, passed away, and it really created a ripple effect in my family, and put me deeply in touch with the complexity of grief, and the ways in which it shows up differently for each member of the family, depending on who the family member was to each person. And grief is a really complicated thing to navigate. In fact, I have a whole episode that I talked about grief that I'm going to share in my show notes that was born out of some of my own experience around grieving the family member this past year. But I don't want to, but this particular kind of lesson or thing that I've been thinking about is less to do with grief and more to do with the ways in which we relate to death. Oftentimes when we're in touch with something that really catastrophically happens in our lives, whether we get a really scary diagnosis or we get really bad news, we lose our jobs, someone near us dies, we experience a tragedy of some kind, sometimes it feels seductive to fall into the sense of you only live once. You have to make the most of it. You have to make the most out of life. And the ways that we do that, the ways in which we make the most of it, is by not sweating the small stuff. That like, what's the point of getting caught up in the small things of life when the big picture is that we're all going to die anyway, right? Like sometimes when I'm staring at the ocean and thinking about the meaning of life, there is a thought that I sometimes have, which is my problems are so small compared to the vastness of the world, the vastness of the ocean, the vastness of life, of our universe. We're so small. Our earth, our experience is so small. And sometimes what that thought does is it localizes and puts into perspective my pain to make it more digestible and navigatable. That my pain, my experience isn't going to kill me, isn't the biggest thing in the world, that there's bigger things than me. And so it allows the pain to feel a little bit more digestible. But sometimes, and this is where I want us to think more deeply about, sometimes when we are looking at the vastness of the world, we might fall under the sense of, then what's the point of even having my pain? Or there's so many people suffering in the world, like I shouldn't complain about my suffering. What is the point of my pain when it's so small compared to the vastness of the space? And so there's a way in which, if we're accustomed to relating to ourselves with a lot of devaluing in the sense of our pain, our wounding, our internal challenges are to be devalued in some ways, then what we find with death or with tragedy is it can often exacerbate the voice within us that tells us that our pain doesn't matter and that we should stop making it such a big deal. It's not a big deal in the grand scheme of things. I would like for us to potentially challenge some of that thinking and instead potentially consider, depending on the circumstance, depending when we're at, that maybe death and tragedy and really terrible things that happen to us is meant to expand us and not contract us. That it's less about what's the point of our pain in the grand scheme of things, and more like the pain is the point in the grand scheme of things. Like death may have put us in, the invitation is that maybe death puts us in touch with the vitality, the importance and the significance of our presence and our experience in this human body, rather than to contract and to devalue and belittle our pain. So less of what's the point of complaining about this when there's people who are suffering so much more, and more like there's people who are suffering and I'm suffering and life is hard and there is meaning here, there is joy here too, rather than like I'm gonna worry less about the small stuff because I'm going to die anyway, and what's the point of worrying about the small stuff? And more like the small stuff, the small ways in which we notice our anxieties and pain and wounding come up are all invitations for us to know more of ourselves. And that the closer we are with death, the more aliveness we get to experience. That death is not there's like I'm thinking right now about like a kind of Buddhist philosophy about the more that we come in contact with death, actually the more alive we can feel. But I think oftentimes we try to make sense of death by moving towards a more nihilistic perspective. And I think what that sometimes can do is it deadens our pain, which I think is seductive, but it ultimately also moves us away from the value of the pain, which is that when we experience pain, when we allow ourselves to get in touch with the fullness of our internal experience, we are also expanding our capacity to be with the most incredible and amazing human experiences that we are afforded in our short time. So I just, having experienced death, there is no right or wrong way to grieve. Each of us have to figure out our way through grief, and especially through acute grief. And it can really rock us and it can shake our foundation. And again, depending on who the person is, we find ourselves navigating so many other complex dynamics and things that go on in other relationships that we didn't expect. Usually the death of a loved one creates a ripple effect of all sorts of different other deaths. And it is an exquisitely difficult process. And may us coming into contact with how trivial in some ways life is expand then and invite more clarity into the importance of letting ourselves feel more, rather than encouraging us to feel less. It's not what's the point of this if we're ultimately going to die, and more it's all the point. This is the point. To feel all and experience all is the point. And isn't that ultimately like what we want? To feel more, experience more, love more? Isn't that why death is so hard and difficult to bear because of our capacity to love. So yes, on the one hand, especially again through acute grief, we may really want to close off ourselves from experiencing more pain by even getting in touch with how much we love. Ultimately, though, I think that there could be of some benefit for us to really grapple with the fact that love and death go hand in hand. And there's something really uniquely beautiful about letting ourselves experience the full heartbreak of death, knowing that we're doing that because it also means that we loved. So that's a big thing that I've been grappling with and thinking about and orienting myself around in 2023. The death of my beloved family member really made me realize that the specialness of the human experience lies in small, small moments. But we are often seduced into believing that life is about the big ones. And the big moments are beautiful too, right? I got to travel to some really wonderful places past year, and getting to see something new, getting to experience something new, having that vitality of aliveness around. I mean, that's all beautiful. But I think what lingers mostly for us when we're really thinking about the ways in which we look back at our lives, I think the moments that we most treasure are the small ones. Like when we laugh so hard that it hurts our bellies, or when we take a bite out of our favorite dessert and we're with the people that we love the most, and when we make a joke that lights up the whole room, and there's this like warm fuzziness in the room with you, and it really drove home for me this past year that the most meaningful part of life is our relationships. It's in some ways the through line that I didn't know connects my entire career up to this point. When I first started with coaching and with teaching yoga, it was really focused on trying to even just be in existence in my body. I didn't care for relationships that much in that they were the things that I wanted, but they weren't important to me the way in which it felt like inner peace was important to me. I thought at that time that those were two separate things. And what I have learned over the years and what I've continued to grapple with in 2023 is that who we are is so interdependent with who is around us, that so much of how we relate to ourselves and relate to each other is born out of how we were related to. And that if we feel unsafe or uncomfortable in our bodies, in our internal landscape, it is often a reflection of not having felt seen and understood by the people around us. Everything that feels meaningful to me in my life comes out of the people around me. And that can be really scary if you are like me and have really struggled with relationships and have felt like if you lean too much into relationships, then you are codependent. And that's a real, I think, tricky thing to navigate, is how much our culture has made us feel like there's something really wrong with us if we allow ourselves to depend and rely on other people. The idea of codependency was born out of something very specific, and then it kind of got moved into pop culture and took a life of its own. And now I see this as like a weapon that we use against ourselves for wanting support from the people around us. I think, especially in times of crisis, the best thing that we can do is to ask for help when we need it and to give help when we can. And both of those things include an interdependence with other people. Self-sufficiency it is important, but only in the context of our ability to navigate relationships in a way that feel fulfilling to us. But I think we often use self-sufficiency as a weapon, as a way to try to cut ourselves off from the complexity of relationships. And so we gravitate towards self-help ideas because we come out of a lot of pain from relationships, and we are given a hope that what is missing inside of us can be given through us, with us, by ourselves. If I lack love, I can give that to myself. If I lack confidence, I can give that to myself. And again, I'm not totally dismissing the importance of self-sufficiency, but I just want to make sure that we're completely clear here that what gets broken in relationships can only be repaired in relationships. There is no amount of giving to self what we need from others. And the irony is, when we start to learn how to receive from others, we start to be able to give to ourselves. They're interdependent, they're interconnected. And that can be really scary. And they can also be very hopeful, because a lot of times what we get out of the self-help world is a sense that we're really broken and that we're not doing it hard enough, because we're being told by self-help leaders that if you just did it hard enough, you will be fulfilled. If you just did enough self-love exercises, you will love yourself. And then you feel that you're broken because you're not able to do that. And then you try to double down and do more, and it leads you to feeling more and more broken. You have to buy more and more books, when at the core of it, so much of our lovability and what it means to love ourselves is going to come out of grappling with and relating to other people. It's hard to be in a relationship with people for a variety of reasons. One of the things that is really hard about it is that it requires us to become very intimate with the feeling of disappointment. This is something that I've been thinking about so deeply, because with the death of my family member, I then really became so much more aware of the fragility of some of my relationships and the disappointment that's born out of expectations about some of these relationships. Now, the self-help world will tell you that the answer to this is to just not have expectations, and then you won't have disappointment. I believe otherwise. I don't think that there's anything wrong with disappointment. I think disappointment is a communication, it's information, it's something for us to grapple with and think about. And sometimes all that we have to do with disappointment is to bear it, and sometimes to talk about it. But if we've never been taught how to, and if we've been told that disappointment is a problem, then what often happens is disappointment towards self turns into guilt. Instead of being disappointed that we didn't do the thing that we said that we were going to do, or that we made a mistake, it gets metabolized, it gets transformed into a sense of guilt. Or sometimes it can go even deeper into a sense of shame. There's something really wrong with us, because it's hard to tolerate just the fact that sometimes we disappoint. We all have limits. We all have limitations. Sometimes we are disappointing. It can be really hard to bear. It's a tremendous amount of internal strength to be able to bear disappointment without it shifting into guilt or shame. And then if we're talking about disappointment in relationship, what's really, if we have a hard time bearing it, it often turns into resentment. We find ourselves very resentful of our partner or loved ones, of our family and friends. And that resentment can erode a relationship. So I don't think that the answer is to not have expectations. We are allowed to expect things of ourselves and each other. Like we wouldn't be able to drive if we didn't expect that people would stop at stop signs, right? Like there's a certain amount of expectation that is important for a society, is important for relationships. However, it is often worth examining our expectations rather than not having expectations, because when we say, I'm not going to have any, it doesn't mean that they go away. It means they go unconscious. So rather than saying, I don't have any expectations, it's more potent or useful to say, here are my expectations. Are they in alignment with what the relationship can do? Why do I continue to expect something these relationships cannot do? And If it leads to disappointment, maybe that is okay too. Maybe disappointment is a sign of intimacy, a sign of a capacity of interdependence, a sign that we care and that we are invested in something. Can we bear disappointment without collapsing into these other feelings that, in some ways, we hope will bypass the disappointment, but ultimately becomes much sharper weapons? Because guilt, shame, resentment can really sharpen into something quite painful. So there's a lot about relationships that got stirred up for me this past year, disappointment being a big one. And what I tend to find is that most relationships can bear a whole lot more than I think it can. Like, I think on some level, I operate as if relationships are a lot more fragile than they are. I think this is very common for people who really identify as people pleasers, in part because we've learned how to people please because we've been, in some ways, communicated that people are fragile and need to be pleased in order for us to be loved. So, rubbing up against that and playing with what it means to risk certain aspects of relationships, knowing that um, I can always talk about it, and that most feelings that come up are actually bearable. Um, and that the more I make sense of my emotional experience and the more that I can bear and tolerate the things that come up in my relationships, the more fulfilling relationships become. That's been a really important aspect of my previous year. And then the final thing that I've been really taking out of 2023 and thinking a lot about over the year, is like what it means to break patterns. Most patterns exist within a relational dynamic, either relationship to self or relationship to other. Um, and most of the times when we think about breaking a pattern, we think about doing the opposite. And this goes back to like my New Year's message about resolutions, and willpower. We often think that the solution to not doing something is to willpower a way to doing it, to doing the opposite of. I think that the unique challenge that that presents is that it's still coming out of the same place. Whether you are a people pleaser and you always say yes, so now you just always say no, or you continue to always say yes, you're still operating in the pattern. You're just doing the opposite, which is still coming out of the same place. Now, that's not to say that there's no value in trying to do the opposite. I think anytime that we notice ourselves in a pattern and we notice that we um, tend to do one thing and we play with doing another, it can strengthen something within us. It can strengthen our capacity to do things differently and see what happens, and to trust that relationships can handle us changing and evolving and growing and playing and stretching. So it's not to say that there's no merit in doing the opposite, but I think it often also creates this idea of binary thinking, right? That you're either doing one thing or the other. Anytime that you may notice yourself in binary thinking, feeling like there's only two options, and it feels really, really clear that there's only two options. Whenever you find yourself in those spaces, it may be worth exploring that maybe right now isn't a time to be problem solving, because there's probably so many more options than the two that is available to you right now. And it's probably uh, there's probably only two options because you're really, really grappling with some pretty big emotions that's limiting what you are seeing, what your options are, what the ways that you can navigate this are. Um, and so, if you're finding yourself feeling like there's only two options, you either do the pattern or you do the opposite of the pattern, there's sometimes an opportunity there to slow things down and to really see if you can work through and explore some of the thoughts and feelings that are coming up for you right now. And what we tend to see is that as we work through some of the beliefs and ideas and emotions that are arising, we start to see that there are actually many more options available. And so the opposite of the pattern is still a pattern. That doesn't mean that that's a bad thing, but it does mean that you're probably going to find that the pattern is going to continue to be alive and exist. And again, that's not a bad thing. It just means that there's an opportunity there to slow down and to really examine what may be going on underneath the pattern. Pattern breaking is a really fun topic. I really like thinking about our relational dynamics as patterns, or as like predictable things that we find ourselves grappling with over and over and over again, because it to me feels like a puzzle, and then we can pick apart the puzzle and see like what may be happening for you that is pulling you into similar patterns. Is it that this is what's happening, or are you pulling this to happen because this is what's familiar to you? There's so much that can be understood and parsed through as we try to understand patterns that can help us break them. So rather than thinking about the pattern breaking as doing the opposite, what I've been thinking about this past year is that maybe we break patterns by slowing it down. Now, the challenge of slowing it down is that it can feel like there's something really wrong, because usually that's not the two binary options that we feel like we have. And usually that sense of urgency that you have to decide and you have to figure it out and you have to make sense of it right away, that's often a sign that there's something else going on underneath. And it can feel really bad and wrong to slow things down. And we may justify that there's no benefit to it, and that we have to decide, and that there's urgency, and that there's deadlines, and no, we have to figure this out as soon as possible. If we can resist that urge and really give ourselves more time than we even think maybe we need, that's usually how I find that things start to make itself more clear, that patterns start to have less of a hook on us. A lot of our patterns are built out of urgency, out of believing that we have to decide, and we have to decide quickly. That's not all patterns. That's not for all people. I'm just saying that that's sometimes what happens. Of course, there are some of us who find ourselves being deeply indecisive, and that is a pattern. And the idea of like slowing down, it's like, well, what do you mean? I'm already slow enough. This may not be applicable for you at that point in time. If we are indecisive, if we're finding that we're kind of going through the same thoughts over and over and over again, we're probably shying away from some of the deeper emotions that are here, that we're avoiding coming into contact with by going into the ruminating and into the thinking. Oftentimes overthinking or ruminating or kind of spiraling in the thoughts, whatever we want to call it, when we're finding ourselves doing that, it's because we're moving away from some emotional resonance that is terrifying and scary. And so we're kind of staying here instead of going a little bit deeper and a little bit further. And so slowing down may still be of benefit at that point in time, but the slowing down isn't in the thinking, it's in the seeing what may be underneath the thinking. 2023 has also, of course, been a very difficult year for many of us around the world. It feels like every year things feel worse. Things feel like they're falling apart, that we're living in a really scary time. And in some ways, this is where I sometimes gain a perspective that feels a little bit more spacious when I tap back into history and I watch history, or I listen to history, and I listen to all these other times in the past, in the 1,000 years, right? 1,000 year plus that we have been around. I know we've been around for more than 1,000 years, but you know what I mean? Like, it gives me comfort to know in some ways that the human experience has always been challenging, and it looks different, and every year something different is happening. But this has also just kind of been part of what it means to be human, is that things are challenging. And I don't know if I have some great motivational message for like navigating that, aside from what I've already shared, which is that yes, things are hard, and when we find ways to support ourselves, to give help when we can, and to ask for help when we need, and lean on each other, and continue to trust and build our relational capacities, we are also expanding our capacity to feel the good things, even in the midst of the scary and the hard things. But it's when we're closing ourselves off and we're hardening ourselves and getting very righteous and very morally superior and very right or wrong. It's usually when we're falling into these binary ways of thinking that either this or this, and these people are evil and that thing is wrong. It's when we're falling into this kind of right, like I'm right and they're wrong and I know what's right and everybody, those people are dumb. Like when we start doing that othering thing, we're probably not going to find sustainable solutions that allow us to be connected to what matters. I'm I'm just aware that there is a tremendous amount of suffering and there's also a tremendous amount of goodness in the world. And may we find our ways of grappling through the suffering so that we can experience all the goodness that there is all around us. So I hope that that's supportive for you. Thank you for being here. And I would love to continue to release episodes weekly, but I'm going to give myself a lot of grace and right now aim for maybe 2 episodes a month. I have some pretty good ideas of things that I want to share with you all in January and beyond. But I am forever grateful for all of you listening to Reclaim, whether you're on YouTube or listening to this podcast, because I know that your attention can be pulled into so many different things. So I really appreciate you. Thank you so much for being here. And I will catch you next time.